and I'm a big fan of the Fantastic Four, a Marvel comic started by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby back in 1961. What this is going to be is an examination of some of what I think are the best Fantastic Four comics. I have no particular interest in reviewing these comics, but more so looking at the way that they tell stories and the things that those stories have to offer. More of a critical look at them, with all of the powers conferred by a degree in English literature. I think that we can come to a better appreciation and understanding and enjoyment of Fantastic Four, which frankly I don't think gets appreciated enough. To that end, I'd like to take a little look at the landmark issue that kick-started the Marvel Age of Comics back in 1961, Fantastic Four #1. There are a lot of things to be fascinated by in Fantastic Four #1, but one of the things that interests me is the motif of monsters. The word monster keeps being thrown around. There's some mild body horror. The bad guy highlights the monstrousness of the Fantastic Four themselves, and there are of course plenty of traditional monsters to boot. This issue is colorful and exciting, but it's also very grim. The monsteriness starts right from the cover, which looks about typical of the comics Martin Goodman's company was publishing during the late 50s and early 60s, before it was officially Marvel Comics, when its bread and butter was monster magazines, westerns, romance books, and teenage humor. Fantastic Four #1 does sort of bridge the gap between Marvel Monster Mags and the dawn of Marvel superheroes. We first meet the Fantastic Four, scientist Reed Richards, his fiancée Sue Storm, her fiery-tempered kid brother Johnny, and Ben Grimm, in a series of misadventures portrayed as quirky and humorous to us, but as utterly terrifying to everyone around them. There are scattered reports of monsters walking the streets. Reed puts people in a panic from page 1, Sue is mistaken for a ghost, Ben is mistaken for an alien, and the military is called out against Johnny. By how much the Four terrorize the town, plus the property damage and accidental threat to life caused by Johnny and Ben, the argument could be made that they are essentially monsters. They certainly seem it to the people around them. But Reed, Sue, and Johnny don't seem to see themselves as monsters. Only Ben bemoans living in a world too small for himself, and constantly hides his form behind a trench coat and glasses. The monster motif continues into the next section, a flashback to the birth of the FF after their exposure to cosmic radiation. We see the horror of the transformations and the terror it sends through the Four themselves. Johnny even accuses Ben and Reed of turning into monsters. However, of course it's Johnny who's the first to come to terms with his fate, as he realizes that his new fiery affliction has also given him the ability to fly. Then, in a beautiful piece of condensed storytelling, they all come to terms with their new forms. The Four stand silhouetted in the flame Johnny created in the underbrush. The silhouettes draw attention to their physical forms, their compositions, their identities, now fundamentally altered, along with their lives and destinies. As they watch the flames burn themselves out, their own fears also subside, and they begin to realize that they are not simply monsters, but more than human, and have the opportunity to give back to humankind more than they ever imagined they could. Even Ben sadly comes to this understanding. Just look how sad poor Ben is. Now, apart from the initial shock of finding their powers, only Ben will go on to still consider himself a monster. Naturally, he's the only one that outwardly looks like one. Ben even refuses to call himself Ben anymore, instead choosing to go by what Sue called him when she first saw his new appearance. A thing. Just look how sad poor Ben is. But with the Four established, we're set to meet their villainous foil, the Mole Man, on monster-infested Monster Isle. Our first proper look at the Mole Man is this blinding lime yellow popping off of this deep purple behind it. It's especially striking since this shade of purple was only used a few times in the first 4 pages of this issue and hasn't really been seen since. So it comes as a bit of a shock. There are printings of this issue that give the FF purple costumes instead of blue, which is an interesting choice which visually connects the FF with their foil, the Mole Man. As it is, aside from some menswear in the first 4 pages, and just a touch to accentuate the FF's private jet, really the only other purple we've seen so far was this light purple for Ben early on in his human form, and then again for Sue when she experiences the horror of her powers. Now, I know these comics were put together in a hurry, but I like to think that there's some sort of a connection between these 2 moments. When Sue goads Ben into flying the ship by calling him a coward, and then when Sue and the others receive their comeuppance, as Ben predicted they would. It may be a coincidence, but if so, it's a happy coincidence. I'm also interested by how this effect of Ben's transformation, maybe indicating the cosmic radiation, bears some resemblance to the Mole Man's reveal, highlighting an interesting, even if unintentional, parallel between the 2 characters, especially once we hear the Mole Man's story. Like Ben calling himself the Thing, the Mole Man also chooses not to use his given name, and we never learn it in this issue. The Mole Man says he was hated and scorned by society simply for his appearance. Depressed, and preferring loneliness to the cruelty of his fellow humans, he went exploring in a desperate attempt to reach a place no one had gone before, the center of the earth. But upon doing so, there was an accident, though he came to terms with his monstrous state and used his newfound abilities to his advantage. That makes the Mole Man a pretty remarkable parallel to the FF. They both went on journeys to places no one had ever been. Upon doing so, they were both in accidents, they both had monstrous results, but they both came to terms with that and used their new abilities to their advantage. What makes the Mole Man a dark reflection to the FF is that he chooses to hurt humanity instead of help it. And his depiction as orange during his origin story only further connects him to Ben. Of course, one must often ask, who is the real monster? The monster? Or the people whose monstrous actions created the monster? They probably didn't feel like they were really hurting the Mole Man with their words, but their scorn would affect him just the same. In a similar circumstance, although the Mole Man is a foil to all the Fantastic Four, he especially parallels Ben, just as Reed, Sue, and Johnny especially parallel the people who helped create the Mole Man. Both the people the Mole Man encountered and the Fantastic Four hurled insults and surely didn't understand the depth of depression and desperation they were driving their targets to. They don't seem to be portrayed with particularly malicious intent, but as lacking empathy. For example, I don't think the parallels between Ben and the Mole Man could be any clearer, but right up to the end, they're totally missed or unacknowledged by Reed, Sue, and Johnny. Reed goes so far as to say that there was no place on Earth for the Mole Man, and that he hopes he can find peace below the surface. Ben sits behind Reed, silent, shadowy, and sad. The art clearly seems to indicate that the irony is not lost on poor Ben. In this last tiny panel, they couldn't be any closer, yet more distant. As we've seen, the majority of the FF don't view themselves or their actions as monstrous. But this demonstrates a subtle, unintentional monstrosity, similar to how they unintentionally terrorized the city at the beginning. They don't seem to realize how they're hurting Ben, and it's this thoughtlessness and disregard that return us to thinking maybe some members of the FF are indeed monsters, by how their lack of empathy hurts others. Granted, it may be hard to empathize with a super strong angry rock man, or a commander of monsters bent on crippling the surface world, which is why the cycle has a tendency to continue once it's begun. So there we are. It's an exciting and colorful issue with a grim realization. Perspective is a basis for monstrosity, and from certain perspectives, our heroes can also have shades of monstrosity within them, mostly unrecognized by the heroes themselves. These characters are heroes, flawed, multifaceted, troubled, and represent what will become a staple for Marvel's superpowered people to come. Heroes with problems. the imperfects. And to keep this from becoming too much of a downer, remember that this is only a first chapter of the Marvel Universe, and there would be much more development and healing to come. You can find Fantastic Four #1 reprinted in these places as well as others. It's reprinted quite a bit. Thanks for joining me on this first step of our journey together through this fantastic tour of ours. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm looking forward to exploring more of it with you. I look forward to doing this again sometime. We should.